Okay, so this talk is going to be somewhat reactive to what's been going on today, so sorry if it's a little bit crude in the way the slides have been put together. But I'm based at the CEBC Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation in Bangor University, but I'm also speaking from the experience of being involved in potentially one of the stakeholder groups, the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, which promotes the conduct of systematic reviews and systematic maps and produces guidelines and standards for their conduct. And it's that sort of experience over the last 10 to 15 years of developing that kind of methodology that I'll be speaking from. And my first reaction to what I've heard today and what I've gained from the case studies is that we need to think very carefully about the questions that we receive and the questions we're sort of distilling out from this process, and the methodology that we decide to use to answer those questions. And so I've decided in such a short talk to concentrate on that issue of matching the questions with the knowledge synthesis methodologies. And I was very interested to hear the discussions that went on earlier in the day about this. So the challenges that have come out from my point of view have been really quite key and significant challenges. If we do go ahead with this process, there'll be a very large range of different needs and requests coming to the NOC. Many different types of questions, you've already noticed that, I suspect, will be submitted. Very different forms of knowledge might be relevant to answering any of these questions. And there are a number of different methods of synthesizing that knowledge, and probably all of those methods will be required at some stage. So how do we start to gain some experience, or at least put together some guidance about how to match these questions that are coming in with the kinds of synthesis that we may need to do? So stepping back a while, in 2006, Bill Sutherland put together a group to look at a whole range of questions that were relevant to the policy needs in the UK. And I was part of that group. And one of the roles I had was to try and start to build up a taxonomy, if you like, of these questions. What different sorts of questions are asked at the policy level? And we got over 1,000 questions in, and we looked at each of these questions and tried to separate them out into different forms. And you can see that the basic taxonomy, which is very crude, showed there were 5 basic different forms of questions. And the most common was a form of question that simply seeks a greater understanding on a particular subject and perhaps greater predictive power. How do we know what's going to happen if we do something, or if something happens? It's being able to predict the future impact, if you like, of certain things. And this includes the kind of horizon scanning, which we're often interested in. What is coming over the horizon? What's going to be the next big problem? But then there were these other 2 significant groups, which are questions about the impact of something, something which we do, anthropogenic impacts, on something else, like biodiversity, or the issue of the effectiveness of something that we do when we're seeking a particular desired outcome. So an intervention is the most obvious thing. We're paying for an intervention to produce a particular outcome. Is it effective? And then there are 2 smaller ones, which we probably don't need to deal with any further, but they're about which is the appropriate methodology to use for something, and if we're seeking sort of optimal management solutions when there are real trade-offs between particular things, real conflicts perhaps. Okay, so the interesting thing was that through the selection process to the top 100, although we didn't know it at the time, those sorts of questions were kept in roughly an even representation. So they do seem to be quite predictable. And we were able to think about the kinds of, in a very crude way again, about the kinds of methodologies which we might use to address these sorts of questions. So for the biggest group, there is the most uncertainty about what sorts of methods should be used. And I think that is going to be carried through into our process as well, because most of the questions which are going to get asked belong to that top group. They are just very, very broad questions seeking more understanding about a particular issue, trying to predict what might happen in different policy scenarios. And for those sorts of questions, we are going to be probably having to use expert consultation to some extent, and we might be thinking of scenario building with horizon scanning and modeling sorts of approaches. However, for the other significant groups, the impact and interventions, it's much more likely that since we're trying to measure something, we're wanting to synthesize quantitative data, and therefore systematic reviewing and systematic mapping becomes much more of a potential method to go for. But again, it may be that we want to combine them with other things like impact assessment or cost effectiveness measures to try and get a more realistic view of the answer to the question. Adaptive management actually came in potentially in trying to optimize management, of course, but I'm not going to take that any further. So here's to the reactive part. This is the list of the questions that you were given in your guide. Sorry for the small writing, but don't concentrate on the questions, just look at the colours. An easier thing to do at this time of day, I think. Up at the top, though, I have got a key. So in red, I've got the impact questions. In green, I've got the effectiveness questions. In blue, horizon scanning, the questions which are really about what's happening in the future. And brown are policy level questions, these big, broad questions, which I don't think are immediately answerable through scientific approaches. Something has to be done about them first. So it's interesting that we got, even within those 10 or so questions, we've got examples of all of these things. So that's great that we've been sort of presented with that challenge. And you can also see that within any one of the questions, there are sometimes two elements, which are quite different elements. So that sometimes there's an impact question, but there's also part of it is a much broader policy issue. And also we've got, in brown, there are good examples of where some of these policy questions are heavily value-laden. In the bottom one, I'm not sure where I got the bottom one from, but it came in somewhere. Should deep-sea trawling be banned is not a scientific question. And if that sort of question comes to the knock, then it needs a considerable amount of what we call unpacking to be able to identify the scientific parts of it that are going to inform that overall policy question, which is a political issue rather than a scientific one. But as regards so one of the key issues that we're going to be faced with is unpacking these big policy questions. Okay, how do we do that? And a lot of the discussion this afternoon was about what the first steps are in trying to unpack these questions. And there is some guidance in how to do this. Stefan actually mentioned it earlier. I worked with a couple of colleagues on looking at the way the health services do this. And when you've got a big overarching policy question like how best to reduce the impact of alien invasive species, there are methods out there to unpack them. This is just one example of the way you take a strategic framework approach and you basically break it down into different strategies that you could use, like prevention, eradication, and control. And then you look at the various interventions that you could pay for to try and achieve those strategies, to try and achieve control, achieve eradication, achieve prevention of those invasions. And then you can start to look at how the relative effectiveness of each of those and decide which of the strategies is appropriate. So we do have ways of breaking these big questions down, and we probably need to work on that quite actively in developing the NOC. But also, we need to think about these methodologies. Looking at the case studies you've just heard about, there are some really big issues that I picked out of those that I think help us to understand which methodologies are going to be appropriate in which scenarios. So, time constraints is an obvious one. Sometimes the policy window is very brief. Sometimes there are really big time constraints. So we need to think about the impact of that on the methodology we want to use. Resource constraints, equally, there's sometimes, very, very often going to be a real constraint on the amount of money that's available. There are often going to be issues which are very controversial, where there are conflicts of evidence, where different stakeholder groups are presenting different evidence. They're already using a problem of, they're already misusing evidence, if you like, by selecting that which represents their case, and where you need some kind of objective synthesis of all the evidence. There are often conflicts of values, which are going to be very difficult to address. There's also a question, Stefan brought up the question of the appropriate scale. The primary research may have been done at inappropriate scales, and we may be asking the question also at inappropriate scales, and so we need to think about that sort of issue. The amount of evidence, the scoping that we can do right at the beginning can tell us quite a lot about the amount of evidence that might be available, and therefore what it's therefore the value that any kind of particular method is going to provide for us. If there is very little evidence, there's very little point in going for a very, very expensive, long, drawn-out synthesis process just to say there's very little evidence. And also, something that I don't find is talked about very much, and that's the fact that these kinds of syntheses will often be challenged very, very aggressively in some cases. And they can be a risk in many ways, so that the methodology that you use may well depend on the risk of getting it wrong, or the impact of getting the wrong answer. Sometimes it just doesn't matter very much if you get the wrong answer, because very few people are concerned about it, and it's a very local issue, and it'll be dealt with at a local level. On the other hand, it may be a very, very big impact to those taking part in the process if the answer is shown to be wrong. So, having got to that stage, what I think I'm proposing, and the way my thinking is going for this network of knowledge, is that we're going to have to provide some sort of decision support tool to everybody involved to try and help match the questions and the nature of the questions and the nature of the situation, the background to the questions and the policy needs with the kinds of methodologies. And just as an example here, I've used systematic maps and systematic reviews. Of course, there will be other columns to this for the other methods, but I didn't go that far. And some example rows which give us some of the kinds of scenarios that we might be faced with. And so the crosses essentially mean probably not worth going for this method, and the ticks are you should probably think about this method as an option. The question marks are aware that we really have to think a bit further about it. So if your policy timescale, for example, is days and weeks, you don't go for a systematic map and a systematic review. It's just not realistic. But if you've got months and years, it may be realistic. If you've got very few resources, don't think about a systematic review. But if you've got a high level of controversy, a high level of conflict of the evidence, then it probably is worth thinking about a systematic review. If you've got a very broad question with multiple different elements to that question, then it's probably worth thinking about a systematic map, before you go for a systematic review. And that was the case, I think, in some of these case studies we heard about. But if you've got a specific question with a measurable outcome, and that outcome is what you're after, a mean effect of something or a mean impact, then you probably do want to go for a systematic review straight away, not bother with a map. If you're bothered about bias, if you're really concerned about minimizing bias in the process, then you probably want to think about a systematic review. But if there's little available evidence, you probably don't need to. Horizon scanning, totally inappropriate for systematic review, really. So a completely different method is required. But if there is a serious risk, if your findings are wrong, if somebody just rubbishes your method, then you probably want to think about something robust like a systematic review. So I want you just to imagine that this is a much larger table with a lot more rows and a lot more columns, and it helps us when we get a question coming in to decide to immediately narrow down the kinds of methodologies which will be appropriate for that question. And I hope we can probably do a bit more in building this over the next couple of days. So, concluding remarks, the question preparation and the consultation process, together with the choice of synthesis, are going to be really key stages. They're the stages I think some of the groups struggled with earlier on. And the more you think about it, the more difficult and challenging it becomes. And so basic guidance on how to match questions to methods is going to be one of the best first steps forward for us, I think. Thank you for listening.